All right. Well, welcome everybody to today's session. We're talking about budgets. And as we all know, budgets can be an absolute joy or they can not be so much joy. Today, before we get started, I just want to talk about what the format is, and then Maheen will introduce our sponsors, and then I will have the pleasure of introducing our speaker. So today's format, we're actually going to do a Q&A format. So we curated a series of questions. So if there are some burning questions that you have, start to prepare them now. We will be certainly leaning in on those as well. We are recording the session for those that might have missed it, or if you need to listen back going, oh, I forget what Richard said. It sounded really good. I just didn't catch it all. Okay. Feel free to listen to the recording. We will try to get it out later this week once the session is done. Maheen.
All right. Thanks, guys. So we have lovely sponsors that actually help us create these events every month. So I'll talk about our silver sponsor first, and then I'm going to pass it over to Stacey to talk about Catalyst. So Mila Associates is a recruited firm based in Chicago that focuses on customer success and technology hiring. They strive to become the #1 talent resource in North America for customer success. Their mission is to create opportunities that are mutually beneficial and embracing the strengths and values of both the individual and the organization, ensuring professional satisfaction is a two-way street. So that is them. So you can obviously look them up, but I'll turn it over to Stacey. Star, if you can move to the next slide. There's a Catalyst slide for Stacey to introduce. Oop.
Hey y'all, I'm Stacey. I'm on the sales team at Catalyst. As a quick introduction of our platform, Catalyst is a customer success platform. So the mission of our organization is to bring customer success to the center of every SaaS business out there. We do that through out-of-the-box workflows for CSMs and the ability to share customer information across your organization, because we are not a seat-based tool. So if you're thinking about as a CS leader or as a CSM, if you're doing things manually in Google Docs and Google Sheets, like health and reporting and life cycles and playbooks, Catalyst gives you the ability to truly operationalize that with very minimal overhead. So I can't actually stay for this whole session. So I will send a link in the chat if anyone would like to attend our next community demo, or it looks like Maheen just did. Thank you so much. If you want to see a preview of Catalyst, you can attend one of those. Otherwise, I hope everyone enjoys the session. I have to jump to another demo, but thank you.
Thanks, Stacey. Well, today we're going to be getting into budgets. I am absolutely thrilled to be introducing Richard today. Richard has over 20 years experience. Don't forget to mute your line if you're jumping on the call here today.
You got one or you didn't? Oh, good.
I'm going to mute. There we go. So Richard has over 20 years of experience. He is quite the world traveler, and I think he probably has touched quite a bit of the world. Not only that, he is a badass runner, and I've had the pleasure of meeting Richard multiple times in a running scene. Today, I'm thrilled to hear all about the experience on budgeting, as a lot of us are going through the budgeting scene. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, pass it to you, Richard, to introduce yourself.
Okay, good. So Star, I hope they all know what a badass runner you are as well. Like typically very difficult to keep up with Star on a Sunday morning long run. She's very good. Thanks for that. Thanks for having me here, Star. I actually welcome the opportunity, and hopefully I can share some information that will be useful to you guys. And Star tells me you guys are all excited about budgets and that type of stuff. So it should be fun. I was a trained school teacher that transitioned into finance. I don't think you would have known that, Star. Like I was a trained school teacher to teach math and English, but I got into finance over 20 years ago, and I pretty much had every role in finance, from an accountant, a finance manager, to the controller, to a CFO, to the global CFO of like a global company. So I've seen a lot. I've worked with companies that were 100 employees to companies that were well over 1,000 employees, or companies that were like 5 million in revenues, or companies that were over 250 million in revenues. So, and every company you go to, budgeting will be somewhat different depending on the company and their business model and the industry they're in, and their size and everything else. I've done budgets where you measure against it the next year and we're way under or way over. But I've also done budgets where multi-million-dollar budgets, we actually ended up exactly to the penny of what we planned to do. So it doesn't happen very often, but then typically you say you get some level of luck to be able to do that. I actually, just before we get into the Q&A, and I know you guys have lots of questions, I thought it might be very useful to spend 5 minutes and do a little bit of an overview, from a CFO perspective of what I see, etc. And I guess the first thing is, why do we go through the pain of doing budgets, right? Like, and I remember a shareholder of mine, or of a company that I worked for in the past. There was one month we were doing terribly against the revenue budget, and he came to me and said, "Richard, why do we do this? Why do we spend 50% of the year guessing how we're going to do next year, and then we spend the other 50% explaining why we guessed wrong," right? And sort of, isn't that like, in many cases the way it goes? But truly, budgets can be a very, very valuable tool in sort of, helping to run a company and how you manage the company. Typically, like, you've got a strategy. That strategy is set by the board, by the shareholders, the CEO, the management team. And it's important that before you even begin this budget process, that you understand the company strategy. Now, some companies are very good at sharing strategy, and some companies are not not that good. And I do think it's important that if you're being asked to put together a budget, that you if it wasn't shared, that you ask all the questions to make sure you understand the strategy, so then you can put together a budget that really makes fits what the company is looking for. And that goes across for every area of the company, right? Whether you be on the revenue side or whether you be on the cost side. But typically that budget, it becomes like a plan of action for each area of that company, right? And in terms of what are you going to contribute to the overall, what the company is planning to do the next year. And say, for example, in the case of CS, is what are you guys going to do to support the business and the revenue expectations and the growth of the company, et cetera, the next year? What investments is going to be required for you to actually do that from a CS perspective? Keeping in mind that typically you'd have like your fixed costs and your variable costs, right? Or what we'd like to say controllable and non-controllable costs, because some things you have control over and it's going to be there regardless of what happens. And there are other costs that you do have control over, and you can flex it depending on what's happening with the business. At the same time, there's these one-off costs that every year you have different one-off costs, right? And that's where typically you get a lot of big ask, and typically where a CFO would really want to thoroughly understand what those asks are, right? Like, and then that budget gives you that measurement tool that you use. Once you get into the next year and you're working against that, it gives you that tool to measure against and say, am I achieving what I wanted to achieve or what the company set out to achieve? And if not, then what actions we need to take, right? It could be you're falling short on the revenue, so therefore, with certain profit expectations in mind, what actions should we be taking on the cost side? Or you're really blowing away the revenues and resources and the support areas are being stretched, and therefore, like, what additional resources you may need to be able to sort of adjust to the growth of the company. So then what's the role of the CFO in all this? Typically, the CFO is one of those people in the organization that understands the strategy, right? Like, they're typically sort of work with the owners, work with the management team, the CEO, but also with the rest of the areas. You understand the strategy, and the goal is to take that strategy and transition it into a financial plan, right? Like, what's the actual revenues we're going to target? What's the actual cost to be able to get that revenues, right? You always start from that point that we have an expectation of certain profitability levels, right? That's why companies are in business, right? You sort of generate revenues, you generate profits, you generate cash flows. So you want to make sure that you have this target in mind, but we're not going to share it with the whole organization necessarily to say this is what we're looking for, because we want you guys to be able to sort of, okay, tell us exactly, we may share like we're looking to grow revenues by 20%, or we're looking, where the revenue might be, but what do you guys need to be able to support that growth? And it becomes a big jigsaw puzzle, right? Because what happens
Richard, I think you might have frozen on us. Oh, now you're back. Go ahead.
Okay.
You stopped that jigsaw. You left us hanging on jigsaw.
All right. It's like this big jigsaw puzzle, right? Like you've got each of the individual area departments of the company would do their budgets. It comes back to the CFO. He puts it all together, and you're going to lose $5 million as compared to we were expecting to make $1 million in profit. I'm sort of exaggerating like a little bit here, but sort of. And then that's where that game of back and forth comes in, right? That's what do we need to do to be able to adjust to the expectations of the company. And that's where you'll start working with all the individual areas of, with the back and forth. So a couple of things I wanted to point out that maybe, and then we'll get into the Q&A, sort of when you're doing your budgets of things that maybe you should focus you should focus on. One we touched on already is to ensure that you understand the strategy, right? So you can put together the best possible budget. The second thing is to be realistic, and we kind of touched on this just before the session started, to be realistic. The budget is not the time to ask for everything under the sun, right? Like, and there are many folks out there, they figure if I ask for double what I need and it gets cut, I'll end up getting what I need, right? But what happens there is a good CFO will figure that out pretty quickly, right? Where sort of that kind of thing exists, and you start to lose credibility, right? And then when it comes for the next thing you need to ask for next year's budget, et cetera, it starts to like, you know what, we're going to start from scratch here. We're not going to just accept what comes in. So that credibility is very important. If you establish that credibility, future budgets become so much easier for you, right? Because that challenging of the budget, et cetera, there is some trust that you've done the homework, you've done all the analysis to make sure that this is, you're doing a good job there. Be detailed, right? Be detailed, build your business cases, document whatever you're asking for, especially the things that are out of the norm, right? Or not the normal recurring, or the additional investment, additional headcount to support growth, et cetera. Be very diligent. CFOs always want to see what's the return on the investment. If I'm going to invest an additional $100,000, what is the company getting for this, right? Like we're not just going to, just open the pocketbook and write that check. We need to understand what it is that we're going to get and what's the return on that investment. The other thing I would point out, and I normally spend a lot of time on this, typically people look at their budgets for the prior year and say, the expectation is I'll grow that budget by whatever that percent is, right? But that shouldn't be an automatic thing, right? That's you should be able to explain every penny that you're asking for that's an increase on year. But even going back to the prior year, having that understanding of not everything you spent last year should necessarily be spent the following year, right? Like it needs to be justified. It's almost going back to a zero cost budgeting, sort of build it from the ground up. And the final thing I'll say is we like to see managers being proactive, right? Proactive in demonstrating the value that you're bringing to the organization, and the budget is a good time to actually demonstrate this. Take the initiative, like look at your business, look at your department and say, is there any excess in here? Is there any anything that we can be make ourselves more efficient? And if you bring that forward, say, I'm going to save, and it's not always possible, right? It's more likely you will be asking for additional, but we like to see that you've done that work to say, I'm not only asking for more, but I'm also like looking at where I can save money, because maybe you can save it here, but you spend it over here, right? On something different. And so you kind of self-funding that initiative that you're wanting to fund. So, I mean, I could go on, but I didn't want to get overly lengthy. I probably went on more than the 5 minutes here as well. But those are some of the things I thought I'd point out, and then maybe we can just dive into the questions.
Yeah, Richard, I jotted down more questions as you were going through that. So thanks for diving into it. Just hitting on your last point, just because it hits home for me as well, and I've used this tactic, and I'm not sure if it's a good one or not, so put me on the right course, is sometimes I steal from Peter to pay Paul, right? Like if I know I have my overall budget for the year and it has been approved, and I'm now moving forward, I'm halfway through the year, and I'm now needing to course correct because either what I thought we were going to spend money on, the business is not ready for it, but I now have this quote unquote slush fund of that cash that could actually start to drive an ROI in another area. Is it acceptable in your opinion from an CFO's perspective when you're taking from one category to move it into the other? Or does that still need to go through like a full formal approval process?
Well, what I would say, first of all, it depends on the company, right? Some companies will have an approval process and you need to follow that sort of approval process. Some companies will take that approach. You have a budget and, as long as you don't go over that budget, you sort of, you're okay. The way I've always liked to do it is that it's not automatic. You get to spend those funds on something different. We're not saying you can't, but there's a process and you need to demonstrate that what this new initiative, what are we getting out of this? How is this helping the company? And it's not just, I didn't spend it, so I'll send everyone off to, a seminar or some, trip someplace or something like that, right? That you're not really seeing the real benefit. But as long as you can justify it, and I think most companies will go along with this, if you can see that there's a return to the company, most companies will go along and say, you know what, that is okay. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is when you have stuff like that, let's say the company overall from a revenue perspective is not doing well, right? And the company needs to, and it might be a company that needs to meet a bank requirement that they need to hit certain profitability levels or, whatever that case may be. Or the shareholder might say, we have to make a profit this year or whatever. You need to take that into account as well. And, a CFO that's taking those things into account will challenge you to say, can even that initiative you're looking to spend, can that wait, right? Or can that be deferred to a later time because we have short-term targets that we need to hit. And that's why it's important that these things go through an approval process because you may not know everything else that's going on in an organization, right? Like that CFO or that CEO that knows that what the expectations are otherwise, or other requirements with a bank or a regulator or whatever it is, need to challenge and may just say no because of these other requirements as well.
What is your favorite thing about the budgeting process? Because you talked initially about the pain that everyone talks about around the budget. But you're CFO. This is like your thing, your jam. So what is your favorite thing about financial planning and budgeting?
So what I would say is the best part for me is when I see things coming together, right? Like you've got, I try to prepare people ahead of time, and provide as much high level strategy and expectations, et cetera. So people are not going way off course, right? But the best thing for me is when it all comes back and it does make sense, right? And your people have done what you expect them to do in a very responsible way, right? That is what makes you feel good that we've got good people, they're taking this seriously, they're trying to help the company. And at the same time, you want to, ensure you're providing for growth for your employees and everything else. But seeing it all come together and knowing that if I have an expectation or a goal that we're trying to achieve, and we're able to get there by, working with our department managers and stuff like that, right? Seeing it all, that jigsaw puzzle all coming together and, fitting well. In my case, every year it ends up that way, but in many cases, it's a very painful way to get there, right? you'd rather avoid the pain as much as possible by having it done in a very responsible way.
Is there, you may have touched on this earlier about, some reaching for the moon and then some being conservative as they're putting their budgets together. But what is, in your opinion, what is the thing that most leaders get incorrect when it comes to putting or planning their budget?
What I would say is, like, it goes back to, I don't know if you say it's incorrect, but not if you don't understand the strategy, right? Because you come and you do a budget that's totally independent on what the company strategy is. And we see this over and over again, right? People just think I'm a cost center and I can, go out and spend and I can whatever, and not understanding what the company is trying to achieve, right? I think that's the one big thing that I wish, and it's not only on the manager's side, it's on the company side to make providing enough information so the manager can very good budget. One thing that I would, of the things that we see over and over again from what the company strategy is and goals are and what they're trying to, Well, are you guys hearing me?
Yeah, you cut in and out, but you cut in at the perfect time. So it certainly worked. So this one is a famous question that I've seen through working with a few CFOs. I assume it's a part of your curriculum when you're getting your certification that everything starts with no, and then you just go from there. It's the all depends or no buts. Richard, let's answer this question. Is it a part of your certification that you're taught to say no initially and then you go from there? Or is there really like a tactic that forces leaders like myself and a lot of that's on this call just to force us to think when someone says no, you're like, oh, now I'm going to have to work for it? What is the strategy?
Okay. First and foremost, we should say that CFOs are not big, scary things that are out there that sort of, So you should always feel very free to approach your CFO and have discussions on stuff, right? But in my case, and I can talk to my case, I am like that. My first answer is no, because the CFO has a responsibility to the company to make sure that things are being done in the most efficient manner to maximize the profitability of the business, because that's why the shareholder started a business, right? Like to say, I got to generate profits, I got to generate cash flows. And it's the CFO's responsibility to make sure that it's, every penny is accounted for and is spent in a very wise, manner. And so and part of it is setting the expectations as well, right? Not everything that comes across is going to be approved, but you say no until you justify to me why, right? So it's not just a no and that's it and it's done. We can look at this, but justify to me why it is you need this spend. What value is it going to add to the organization? How is it going to help the company? And what's that actual return? And we do this a lot with things like marketing initiatives, right? Or those kinds of things, because there's all kinds of stuff that comes forward but we can't really quantify what the benefit is going to be, right? Well, but you've got to have a very good plan as to why you're asking for the spend. And the answer is no, until you can justify to me to say, this is going to add value to the company, to the organization, increase the shareholder value, et cetera, right? That's a responsibility of the CFO to make things that efficient.
All right, I'm going to have to try that tactic. Oh, you want a promotion? No. And now justify why you want the promotion. I'm kidding for those that actually work for me that's on this call. All right, the next question I have for you is, when should budget planning start? Like say you are on a fiscal year and it starts at, or a calendar year of January to December. When should actually budgeting be started?
I guess the question is when it should and when most companies actually how they do it, because some companies like a long budget planning process, right? And it goes on and on and on, it never ends, right? Even into January and February, it's still ongoing. And I always like it that I typically, it doesn't matter how big the company is or how small the company is, condense it to like within a 6 week, say a 6 week process. I typically, when I work for US companies, I always like the budgets to be done by US Thanksgiving, right? And I use US because that's when sort of a lot of my roles have been with US companies. But if it's a Canadian company and your fiscal year is January to December, you'd want the budgets to be, I would say you'd want the budgets to be done by late November, early December. And then I typically work backwards from there and say, we need 6 weeks, it may drag on 7-8 weeks, but 6 weeks is what I always target, keeping in mind the back and forth that will, working with the finance team and stuff like that. But I would say a lot of companies like to, they'll be done by say the end of November, early December, but they like to do a refresh of their budget come the first week of January to account for anything that might have changed, like between say in the month of December. But I would say that that's not the norm. Typically, I like to see budgets locked down by say first week of December and having condensed it to like less than 2 months, a less than 2 month process.
Is there anything that leaders should be thinking about going into the budget prep side of things? Like, what should they have kind of in their back pocket or thought through before they even get to the start of that 6 week process?
Well, you should always be, it goes back to the strategy as well, is what I would say, right? Like understanding the strategy, knowing like what are the things that you would like to focus your, because you would already know what's in the pipeline, right? Like what are the big customers you're working with? What are the big implementation you might be working on, et cetera? And how do I deal with those like into the next year, right? So you want to go prepared with as much information in terms of what's already happening, right? And then thinking ahead, what additional things will I be required to do next year? And come prepared with like the support for that as to what you're going to ask, the business case, what the return's going to be, et cetera. But having that full understanding of not only the strategy, but everything else that's going on in the business at that point in time as well, yeah. And being very specific, right? Like with your quantity, I think coming forward and ask, I'll put a sort of an amount of money. I want to do this, but I don't know how much it's going to cost. And I'm going to put a bucket of money in there, and we're going to use that to cover off these kinds of things when they come up. We don't like that, right? You want to make sure you come prepared with what are those initiatives and quantify them as best you can. You may not be perfect. You may not have all the information, but you do want to take a stab at quantifying those types of stuff, right? Having an unknown amount of money to allocate to projects as they come along is not a good thing in my books, yeah.
Is that the same thing as it relates to like software, right? Because software is a tough one to sometimes get a rough estimate of what it's going to cost because it depends on, but you need to maybe buy software for efficiencies. And you might even know that, you're going to dabble into maybe this, but you haven't quite sure which one you're going to land on. So I guess in that case, you can't have a like slush fund per se of software budgets, because you could say to optimize for X, Y, or Z, but you might not necessarily know, that it's going to be 50,000 for this product, another 12,000 for this product, and another 18 for another, for example.
No, but what we normally do what we normally do and stuff like that. Let's say you looking to implement a budgeting software or like whatever the software, expense management software or something like that. It doesn't mean you can't, like, you may not know what you want to go with. You may not know exactly what, that system is going to be yet or anything, but you can certainly get quotes on like, those types of software, right? At least it gives you a ballpark sort of, what it does, it shows you've done some homework, right? And that's what we like to see, right? That you've done homework. I'd have guys come to me with stacks of paper, right? Because they've gone out and they've got quotes of all different kinds to justify why they might be asking for something in the middle, right? Of whatever quotes they've received and stuff. So, there's lots of companies out there that will use that approach to bring us some quotes so we have an idea. I think the one thing that might be agreed is I do want to implement this software for efficiency purposes or for whatever it might be, and that might be accepted, and then it becomes a quantification of that, right? And doing some quotes like of 3 or 4 different products might give you that idea ahead of time.
Awesome. I'm reading through the questions. All right, so I can only assume there's some fancy tools that's out there, Richard, that you must use, unless you're really like a Excel geek like I am, that, I call Google Sheets shits just because it's not the same as Google or Microsoft Excel. I don't know if anyone else on the call agrees with me or not. I see some nods. What type of fancy tools do you typically use when you're preparing a budget? Or do you lean on like the rudimentary tools like we all use, like Excel?
Yeah. So actually, I saw that question on your thing, and I actually chuckled a little bit because I've through different companies, we've spent a lot of money implementing like software sort of budgeting tools, right? And in a number of cases, we even abandoned those tools like shortly after implementation, et cetera, because you go through this process and you end up doing a lot of the work in Excel to then feed these budgeting tools, right? Like, I mean, when you go out and you source these products and the way they're presented to you and they do all kinds of magical things and they'll do, everything you want under the sun. In reality, what I have found anyways is, yes, there are some good tools, but typically the way we end up using them is we do a lot of the work in Excel. And then if you want to do scenario analysis, what if this, what if that, et cetera, it's so much easier, or folks doing it in Excel, and then you feed it into this system, right? Because once it feeds into the system, then you can use it for tracking and other things like that. But to actually do a budget, I've never worked for a company where a product was used to completely do the budget, right? There was always Excel used in some capacity. And even the last company at AFX I worked with, we were a big global company. We were pretty much in about 17 or 18 countries, hundreds of millions of dollars in revenues. And guess what we used? We used Excel, right? And Excel can get pretty sophisticated, right? Like it might be a little slow when you get into consolidating hundreds of templates and stuff like that, but Excel can do some pretty cool things. So I'm still a fan of Excel myself. And most of the companies I've ever worked with has continued to use Excel even after implementing some of these fancy tools.
That's really good to know, because I've gone through the route of using fancy tools, and then I still have to do them myself in Excel, even when I'm submitting them to the fancy tools. So I love that you also have a similar experience from a CFO perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is a great question that came in from Selena yesterday or the day before, and I thought it would really hit home as, and you mentioned at the beginning, right, that budgets are put together based on some form of assumptions. And that could be anything. It could be rev targets. It could be, whatever the goals might be. But then, well, those are assumptions. Sometimes your assumptions are off by quite a bit. What do you do then? Right? Like, do you like some companies that I've worked for, they'll do a re-budget or they'll reevaluate their budget to kind of do a course correction halfway through. Some companies won't. You just kind of full steam ahead. What happens from a CFO point of view when all those assumptions were just really bad assumptions?
Yeah, or were they bad assumptions, or the company was just unable to execute on sort of the strategy or things that they were going down? But anyway,
maybe both, if we're being fair, or they were just overzealous of what they thought they could actually accomplish.
I raised that question because it's exactly what happened, which is, there was a strategy in place for growing the business, X%, increasing sales, right? Growing the sales team, therefore CS needs to grow, and et cetera, et cetera. And then that rev target never happened.
Yep. Okay. And were you already staffed up to those levels, or were you?
No. So the budget, even though I asked for everything under the sun, was based on something, which was I was told that, assume that we're going to double our business over last year, right, in sales. And this is the dollar number. This would translate, we anticipate this many new logos, different segments and what have you. And so I based my headcount on that. But one of the other hard parts was there was a role that never existed that I added to the budget because I saw it as a real need, right, to support the team. So some of, what I found difficult was it's not like I could say this person is directly tied to revenue. So when we talked about like return on investment, it's difficult to say what that return is, because it was more of a supporting operations role, right?
Yeah.
And then we never hit those numbers, and it was just the budget just didn't seem to matter. It's like all that work was kind of wasted.
Yeah. And you know what? That happens a lot as well, right? That is for one reason or the other, things didn't end up happening, whether it's wrong assumption or, company change course or whatever it is. But that's one of the important things about why budget should not only be a once a year exercise. You do the budget and you're done, right? It should not be. Like, good companies will continue to do quarterly reforecast, right? Like of the business, to say, you know what, we thought we'd be here by the end of Q1 and we're not here. And this is where a good CFO will also work with the business to say, you know what, we're not executing on this, this, and this. We thought we'd do this, we're not doing this anymore. And therefore, we need to come up with actions that we're going to take, because it doesn't make sense for CS to do this if sales is not going to do this, right? Like, and actions need, this, and that's where the CFO should be working with the business to, in terms of implementing actions that we should take. We should freeze on any of these types of new hires, or, if we had already hired, how do we redeploy, or how do we, what do we do? Because you got to keep in mind that if sales didn't do this, but you're still doing this, the company profitability will be impacted, right? And somewhere down the road, someone's going to be screaming to say, well, what happened, right? Like, so you want to preempt all that, right? And then as a manager as well, I would say that's where you get a chance to be proactive. You know that need was, you planned for that need, but that need, as you see it, is not materializing, right? So what can you do, even without your CFO coming to you? What can you as yourself do to say, you know what, we can save the company some money here, right? Or maybe if I have this resource, it can be redeployed. Maybe some other part of the organization can use this resource. But it's you should continuously be reforecasting, be course correcting. That's why you did the budgets. You measure against it, and if you're and that doesn't only mean if you're off. Like, if you're doing better than you thought, you also want to course correct and say, I need to, add, resources, etc. It goes both ways. But good companies, you'll find, will continue to reforecast and course correct as they go, because profitability should always be kept in mind as well.
Great answer, Richard. I know there's quite a few of us that's on the call that's in budgeting, and I'm going to put one person on the spot, and I'm sorry already. I know that you're in budget season right now. Is there a question specifically that you might have for Richard as you kind of go through your journey?
Yeah, I think you've actually answered a lot of the burning questions I had. One of Selena's questions that I'm trying to work through right now is, how do you make an ask or make a case for a headcount that hasn't existed yet, whether it be something to help like operationalize the team, enable the team, or what I'm also trying to do is actually find people leaders.
Yeah.
So, and I'm like trying to put together the case of like, I can continue doing this, but I'm about to have a breakdown, or we like start putting together like middle managers. I'm not really sure how to best like put that like case together and what the ROI is going to look like, because there's a lot of it's hypotheses or like assumptions I'm making of like the team is X size now, so there needs to be another layer between this or that, or in order for us to scale, we need operations. And I'm taking like a lot of benchmarks from other companies, but I don't think it's like I would love some suggestions on how to best like approach it and like build a case around it when it's never been something the company has seen before.
Yeah. So I think like the best way to approach that is like, and are you saying like a role like this is not one that is attached to revenues then, right? Like it's not, but you're
not directly.
Not directly, yeah. But typically I would imagine in CS, I don't know necessarily in CS, what are the metrics you use on how you know how efficient your department is operating, right? Are people being overburdened, working too hard, not working, do you guys use number of transactions or number of implementations or number of, whatever it is. But you want to make sure that you have those metrics, those KPIs that you use. And you said you don't have industry benchmark, but typically we like to see industry benchmark if you can get any to say a typical CS function will handle so many of this, implementations in a year or something like that. But what you do want to make sure you're demonstrating to say, if it's that the rest of folks are working too hard and this individual need to pick up, some of the slack, you need to demonstrate they're doing, every task takes like 5 hours to do, and they need to do 2 of these tasks a day. Like, they can't keep up, right? We don't want to overburden, we don't want to work our staff to the bones, whatever. And so therefore, based on these metrics, if you want to continue for us to support this business in, whatever it's doing, we need to add a resource. Otherwise, we're going to burn out staff, and then we're going to have a bigger problem to deal with, right? And CFOs are very big on that as well, because they know that down the road, if you don't take the right action to support the business, you're dealing with bigger problems down the road, right? Like, people are going to start making mistakes. They're not going to do the job as diligently as they're doing. They might leave, they might quit. You'd have to rehire. You'd have to incur headhunting fees. You'd have to, do those types of stuff. So it's important to bring those kinds of stuff out. But benchmark is one of the big things we tend to look for, KPIs, metrics, as to how you monitor performance. And we like to see historic, sort of not just come up with a one-time set of, I don't know if you track these KPIs over time, but that also gives you a good indication as to how they're moving and what action you may need to take. So I don't know, is that does that answer the question, or is it?
No, it does. Can I ask a follow-up question? Sorry.
Yeah.
Sure.
I don't know if you can answer this, but when we do like even headcount planning and like forecasting, and there's a budget aside, I don't know if this sits under CFO or actually HR's purview, but we're looking at the headcount and the cost of the headcount of like what we understand based on the team today, but salaries are increasing. The US is poaching on talent. When like you think someone is X amount, but then the new people you're hiring is like a lot more than that, where does that factor in? Like, how do I work around that? I know this isn't related to budget, but I just now have teetered off into another conversation.
Yeah,
but no, this is a common problem in customer success, also in engineering right now, because there's an inflation between what the market rate is and to what the staff currently is today as well. And so there is that gap, and then you're going to have like compensation reviews come up, and there's going to be that big delta. Richard, how do we handle that?
Yep. Actually, funny enough, my son actually works for this technology company. And he started 3 years ago. Compared to new folks coming in, he was being underpaid. But what was happening, a lot of people were leaving, so the company just went across the board and brought up everybody else, right? So different companies, some companies can afford that, some companies can't, right? Like, and that would be the challenge. And the one thing we know is people talk, right? So people will kind of know what the others are, that there is a discrepancy. And it causes all kinds of other unrelated or related unhappiness and stuff like that. This is where we typically, the way I've always done it is every year we work with our HR folks and we do a little bit of a market sort of analysis to say, for these roles, now you can't do like these market analysis at times can be costly as well. So you can go overboard on doing these market analysis, but we won't necessarily do all roles every year. We may do a different set of roles. So we're not, we're addressing them every couple of years, but you go out and you get some market data to say for these roles, this is what we see. And this is where our people are with that level, our people with that level of experience. This is where they are. And we start to take steps to, we can't do typically all in one go. So we'll say there might be a 20% differential. You know what we'll do next year? We'll give you like maybe 5 or 6% over and beyond what your normal adjustment would be. But we'll let you know that put you on a path to say, you know what, we realize that this is an issue. We'd love to keep you, you're a great worker, you're et cetera, and we're going to put you on a path that over this 3-year period or 2-year period or whatever it is, will bring you to, roughly market what, where others would be currently. And most people, like, especially if they like the company and et cetera, knowing that they would be on a path to being, having that addressed, you get more engagement from them, right? You get them in a better place. but to just do nothing would not be an option as well. So from a cost perspective, a CFO is going to have to suck it up and just, understand that that is sort of something that needs to happen. Most companies will not be able to do one big adjustment to keep all staff, bring all staff up to market, right? So you have to find an approach that works for your company, and staggering it over a couple of years is generally what I find worked for me. Yeah.
Leona, another tip from a CS perspective that I find works really well when working with budgeting is don't be precise on what the head count is for your individual. Like, if this individual makes 7,000 or 75,000, blah, 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 you look at creating like pay bands. And so you have pay bands that's based on competency levels. And then in my experience, I love when finance uses like an average of those pay bands instead of just going with the exact cost, because then you're always going to be off, right? Because if that employee gets promoted, then what is that change that's within it? Richard, do you have any commentary, or is my suggestion completely off base?
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And the other thing to keep in mind is you have to understand the performance of those individuals as well, right? Like, are they doing a great job? Are they not doing that great a job? Because you need to take those performance rating and all that stuff into account when you're doing those types of stuff. But yeah, you're right. Using the pay bands and stuff is what companies do, right? You never get an exact number, and it's obviously based on the experience level of the individuals as well, right? Yeah.
Excellent. Richard, any final, closing thoughts that you'd want to leave individuals that's here today as they're working on their business plans or their budget plans and financial plans going into 2022?
Yeah, my biggest thing, if I can say, is like, if you don't yet understand the strategy of the company, make an effort and you can start with your CFO, you can start with your, I don't know how accessible your CEO is or who is the right people, but if you don't understand the strategy and what the company is trying to do next year and that type of stuff, especially a lot of these smaller companies are growing really fast, right? And things change on the fly as they go. But understanding the strategy is going to give you a really good idea as to what you should be planning, for. And the second thing is, I can't reiterate about being realistic. I've seen too much of where people ask for stuff just because, as opposed to what they really need, right? Be realistic in what you're asking for, and you'll find that you're very likely to get that approved, as opposed to being challenged and stuff. So.
Thank you so much, Richard. I'm so grateful for you to be here as we're all working through the budgets. The commentaries that's coming up is fantastic. For the community as a whole, we have our next event that's coming up in November, and we will have one of the members that hit the 25th strategist will be speaking. A lot of you might actually know him. Maheen, do you want to announce who our speaker is?
Yeah, so Peter Armali is actually going to be joining us, and we're going to be focusing on similar to our numbers theme that we've had this past quarter on key CS metrics. He's going to dive a little bit more deep on what that is, and also how to showcase value within your CS org. And the date is, I believe it's the third Wednesday in November. Similar pattern that we have for our past events.
Excellent. Thanks, Maheen. Well, thanks everyone for participating. For those that are watching later of the session, if you do have additional questions, please move over to Slack. I'm sure we will all be able to help you with any questions you have. If not, I will go back to my friend Richard here and ask him to help with some questions. Thank you, Richard, so much. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.
Yeah, thanks, guys. It was fun.
All right.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Cheers.